Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you are joining us from today. My name is Cherise Dalton, and I work with Actify, and I'd like to welcome and thank you all for joining today's webinar on supply chain strategies for manufacturers post-COVID-19. As a reminder, all attendees are muted and in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. Should you have any questions during the Q&A portion of the presentation, please submit them through the questions panel of the webinar dashboard. Today, we have the honor of presenting for you manufacturing and supply chain expert Jim Shepard. Jim began his career in manufacturing operations as a director of supply chain management and a vice president of manufacturing. Jim is an independent consultant providing guidance on advanced manufacturing strategy and technology. He recently retired from Plex Systems, where he served as the Vice President of Corporate Strategy. Jim also previously served as Vice President and Distinguished Analyst for Gartner, Inc., the world's leading information technology research company. Prior to Gartner, Jim spent a number of years in the enterprise software industry. Joining him for the Q&A portion of this webinar is Actify CEO Dave Opshal. Dave was formerly VP of Corporate Development for TechSoft 3D and Managing Director of SageMark LLC, a consultancy working with technical software developers on users on sales, marketing, corporate development, and implementation strategies. He's the founder and first executive director of the 3D PDF Consortium, an industry trade group responsible for advancing data interoperability standard for the manufacturing and AEC industries. We are thrilled to have them both here today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim.
Thank you, Cherise. Good day, everybody. As Cherise said, what we wanted to talk about today was the impact of the pandemic on manufacturing supply chains. Not so much the short-term impact. Obviously, we're all aware that supply chains have been devastated by this event, but our belief that as we go forward, manufacturing companies are going to have to rethink the way they manage their supply chains in fairly profound ways, and we want to talk about that. Dave and I will discuss some of those issues and certainly take questions from all of you that you might have about this subject. So with that, let me run through a presentation with some observations, and then we'll go to the question and answer. So one of the things that we've seen, obviously, in the several months of the pandemic is just crazy swings in supply and demand. Demand for many things just falling off the table, and other things just soaring, and supplies being impacted by factories being shut down, by regulatory issues, by transportation issues, all kinds of things that interrupted inbound supply. And so in some respects, the only real industries that have gotten moving quickly, for obvious reasons, were healthcare and food and beverage. They had overwhelming demand, which in some respects makes it easier, and somewhat disjointed, but nonetheless strong government support to help those industries cobble together supply chains to keep the flow of healthcare supplies, equipment, and food and beverage coming. But almost the rest of the manufacturing industry, people have really focused their attention on trying to keep the company safe and the employees safe, and are just now beginning to reopen and think about trying to reconstruct their supply chains. One of the things we believe going forward is that your customers and your investors are going to expect that you will substantially re-engineer your supply chains to be able to deal with these kinds of disruptions. It's not that we haven't seen disruptions in the past. I don't think we've seen anything quite as fast and unpredictable and profound as this. And there's going to be an expectation that manufacturers will figure out how to deal with this in a more effective way than we have. And as it clearly, we have seen a considerable number of health-related disruptions over the last 20 years or so. Nothing on this scale, but certainly a number of them. We've seen weather and climate change disruptions. We've seen war and trade wars and tariffs and strikes and so forth. All of those have impacted the supply chain, and I believe that as the supply chain has stretched out and become more complex and more global, and companies have become more dependent on it, we are much more vulnerable to these kinds of disruptions than we've been in the past. And one of the areas that that became very obvious early is that nobody had an adequate model for dealing with this. Now it is called the novel coronavirus because it was brand new, and so the fact that no one had a precise model, even the best of medical researchers, is understandable. But I think more importantly, it pointed out the fact that manufacturers in a lot of cases are not doing an adequate job of modeling, supply chain modeling, and I'll talk about that a little more as we go forward. Another one that was very apparent in this was the impact of national and international politics. You know, governments responded in a very disjointed way. No two countries, or in some cases states or regions, had the same policies. They couldn't get it synchronized, and that obviously had lots of impacts, but it had a substantial impact on supply chain responsiveness and readiness. But I think it also exposed the fact that in this extended global supply chain, politics is going to be increasingly important. So we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that really has been apparent for a long time is that as supply chains have stretched and extended and become more important, communication and visibility have not improved, have really not evolved along with that. And so, again, in this highly disruptive environment, we've seen exactly this situation of companies in the supply chain at various tiers not being able to adequately communicate with one another. And we will visit that one. A pet peeve of mine for a long time that again was exposed by this event was what has evolved into a highly adversarial buyer-seller environment in manufacturing, and I think that it caused companies to have difficulty figuring out how to respond adequately down the supply chain for an event that no one could have anticipated. Another thing that it's really been apparent over the last few kind of major climate and weather disruptions. I think about the tsunami in Japan. I think about the volcano eruption in Iceland, for instance, is that the kind of standard contract language that the companies use to handle purchase contracts really are not adequate when it comes to what's called force majeure, the act of God kinds of events, and what happens there, and we're seeing it again. This is going to be in litigation all over the world for a long time and so we'll talk a bit about what might be done around contracts to handle these kinds of things better. And then finally, we have been on a path for, I would say, the last 20 years or more, a prevailing supply chain strategy that was driven by a desire to reduce component costs and material costs, to, in some cases, gain penetration to new markets. But we've ended up in this heavily offshored, single source, single tool, just-in-time inventory supply chain posture that I think has contributed. Well, there are many benefits to that from a cost and efficiency perspective. One of the things that's apparent is that it does hamper flexibility and responsiveness in a situation like this, or it doesn't have to be quite this bad in any kind of circumstance where there's substantial change or uncertainty. So let's look at some of these in more detail. Supply chain modeling. Actually, the software around supply chain modeling has gotten to be quite good. They're really good applications for supply chain planning, but most manufacturing companies aren't using them adequately. They tend to view it as, this is my forecasting system. They may be pretty sophisticated about how they do forecasting if they are selling directly to consumers or to big box stores, but for the most part, they really aren't using the power of those tools. And one of the things that they are very good at is helping with supply chain risk assessments by being able to model risk to the supply chain and surface situations where we may be vulnerable in a circumstance of change. The whole idea of that kind of risk assessment and modeling is to understand in advance of a disruptive event where the potential problems are, where we may be vulnerable, where we need to take action. And it may be as simple as changing inventory stocking policies. It may involve things like multiple sources or rethinking the source itself. So we'll talk about some of those, but that's the point of supply chain modeling. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that it hasn't been done very well. And one of the things that almost nobody does very well is to model inbound supply. They tend to focus on demand and do sort of best case, worst case demand scenarios and do some planning around that. But rarely do they model the inbound supply chain. Even one level down, their direct suppliers, never mind multiple levels down, which in a lot of cases is where some of the greatest vulnerabilities are. So I think in the future, we will see companies needing to do a much more sophisticated job of modeling, because these kinds of disruptions in the world are just not that rare. There's, as I mentioned, the climate and weather ones. There's trade wars. There's actual wars. There's financial disruptions like the Great Recession, and then there's healthcare. There's any number of these that need to be anticipated, and really need to be anticipated now that we are a part of and rely on these very long, complex supply chains. When everybody was vertically integrated and made everything in-house, it was far less of an issue. Another one that I mentioned, politics. This is the subject nobody wants to talk about. Manufacturers know that there's not much they can do about it. They don't They join industry associations. If they're large enough, they may do some of their own lobbying. But they're limited as to how much influence they can have on domestic politics, or in some cases even state and local politics. But the fact is that if I have a supply chain, outbound or inbound, that stretches across multiple countries and continents, political jurisdictions, I can't ignore politics as I'm thinking about and planning for my supply chain. And it's become very obvious during this particular crisis, but it is simply the reality that in a global supply chain, politics is a major risk factor, and needs to be thought about and modeled and provided for. As I think about my supply chain strategy, I have to understand what actions might occur as a result of political change or upheaval or policy changes. And I think that one of the things we're already hearing rumblings of, and we have been for some time, is countries talking about much more aggressive, national and regional manufacturing policies, trying to use this as a reason to force reshoring. I'm not sure that most countries really have the willpower or political ability to have a coherent national industrial policy. Some do, but not many, and certainly not ours. But nonetheless, there will be pressure. So, as you start to think about decisions about where you're going to source products or where you're going to manufacture products, politics are going to be involved there, like it or not. There's the potential for that to become a political issue, and that needs to be factored into your supply chain thinking and planning. Another area, and again, this is not something that's being caused by COVID-19, but the speed and the kind of profound change of the pandemic has just highlighted what has been a problem for some time. As we've gotten to supply chains that have much higher velocity and much greater complexity, and most companies are in a situation where they are part of multiple customer supply chains that may stretch halfway around the world, and they may have very complex inbound supply chains of their own. Our communication, not necessarily the technological communication, but the actual communication and visibility that goes on within the supply chain, is just not adequate. In a lot of cases, what we see is kind of single tier communication. So EDI signals, for instance, that go between buyers and sellers, or sellers and buyers. And they're transactional, send me X amount, I sent this amount, but there's not much meat there. And I think as you think about the interconnectedness and the speed of these supply chains, it's obvious that, while that transactional system needs to exist, there needs to be a much more robust set of communication going on down multiple tiers in the supply chain. So if an OEM makes a change or anticipates a change, whether it's quantity or an engineering change or whatever, the implications of that cascade all the way down the supply chain. And how fast that information can get down the supply chain, how coherent that signal is, how quickly the information about the ability of the supply chain participants to respond to it comes back up the chain is critical for making this work properly. And so when you have a situation like we're in right now, where you have dramatic changes happening all over the place at the top of the chain, where demand is in some cases plummeting, in some cases soaring, where certain where factories may be shut down in certain regions because of outbreaks of the virus, where transportation is severely disrupted. Not having that communication is a disaster. And one of the problems, one of the historical problems in this industry is that um, companies are very hesitant to share supply chain information with one another. It's viewed as proprietary. I don't want it to get out. I'm afraid my competitors will see it. And that attitude, that long historical attitude about protecting this information, um, has really hampered the ability for participants in the supply chain to communicate effectively with each other. There was this sort of 1950s, 1960s, even 1970s mentality of sort of fortress manufacturing, where everything went on inside the four walls of the factory and I never let any information outside. That's not the way we work anymore. As much as 60% or 80% of all the content of a product may be manufactured externally. It's coming from 10 countries, coming in a variety of transportation modes, and you simply can't manage that unless you're sharing information and a broad set uh, of kind of formal structured information, as you would get in an EDI signal, as well as more unstructured information and guidance about what's happening, what's changing, what are our capabilities, et cetera. And so, I think this needs to be addressed in a very robust way by manufacturers. And I expect that the largest manufacturers, the OEMs and tier ones, having seen what kind of vulnerability they have to disruptions below them in the supply chain, are going to demand the ability to monitor inventory and production and supply status down the supply chain in a way they've never done before. There has been some of that, but not much and not in a consistent way. And my belief is that as a supplier, if I have that ability, that becomes a competitive differentiator for me. If I have better information that I can share in a better way, that's one of those things that can distinguish me as a supplier over and above, great delivery statistics or great quality. Uh, Another one of the issues that I think is contributing to the difficulty people are having and will have in recovering from this supply chain disruption is that we have evolved this highly adversarial relationship between buyers and sellers in the manufacturing supply chain. We have a situation where the purchasing community is basically measured in gold on reducing prices. And, that's not the only thing. Obviously, they're expected to, have quality and delivery performance and all of those things. But that kind of relentless pressure to drive down costs has ended up in this cascading environment where OEM procurement is putting enormous pressure on tier one and setting very high objectives and penalties and so forth. And tier ones in turn, who are mostly trained by the OEMs, are doing the same thing to their suppliers, and it just runs down the chain. And that kind of highly punitive uh, uh, environment of pushing the risk and liability down the supply chain instead of operating in some kind of a mutual and collaborative way is really damaging, and it's been damaging for quite a while, and it is going to really hamper companies' ability to have real resilience to change. If you don't have that kind of cooperative environment with your suppliers, the ability to understand them and know them and share information with them, you're simply not going to be able to respond when there's a huge surge in demand or a huge drop in demand or some other disruption in the supply chain. There are, this is particularly true, I think, in North America and Europe. In Asia, and particularly in Japan, there is a sort of different tradition around relationship-based sourcing, where there's far more sharing of information. There's a much more integrated relationship, integrated at the senior executive level, at the purchasing and sales level, at the quality level, manufacturing, engineering. Companies work with their suppliers. In many cases, there's an ownership position as well. I'm not necessarily advocating that that we move, we become Karetsus, but we need to get to a situation where the relationship between buyers and sellers is much more equal and much more open. And one of the issues that I've seen over and over again, and we're seeing right now, is it's shocking how little purchasing knows about the suppliers. They don't know the financial stability of the company. They don't know its ownership. They don't understand the strategy. They don't necessarily understand the capacity and capabilities. It's just a transactional relationship. And particularly in this, highly brittle, extended supply chain, where almost everything is sole sourced, that's really dangerous. There needs to be a much more comprehensive relationship between buyers and sellers. Another part of that problem is procurement contracts. They haven't changed much in a long time, and they are a real issue at the moment. One of the things that I've been telling my clients is you need, right now, while we're in the middle of this pandemic, you need a triage to figure out what are the procurement contracts that are keeping you running, and then dig into those and find out, what are the terms of those agreements? Which ones do we need to renegotiate? Some cases, which ones of those do we need to replace? One of the things companies, have to face is that within their supply base, they may be looking, or in cases, it won't necessarily be their direct suppliers, but as they look down the supply chain, there are going to be bankruptcies. We're going to see a bunch of Chapter 11 filings. Companies aren't going to survive this process comfortably. And that's always a problem if your supplier declares Chapter 11. It's going to be particularly complicated in this case because some of the government stimulus initiatives have impacted what the filing rules are and disclosure rules. So it's going to be important to understand that stuff. I think in a lot of cases, or certainly in a number of cases, you may find yourself negotiating not with your supplier, but with the private equity company or the creditors that own that company, because the situation financially is going to be that dire. And if you need that supplier and you need the goods that they provide, um, you know, you may need to be prepared to be having those conversations. And in some cases, you may be in a situation where, in order to assure that supply, you might have to provide some accommodation, some financial assistance to keep that supplier moving, because some of them are going to be in real trouble. And then on an ongoing basis, as we think about contracts in the future, one of the obvious things, as I mentioned before, is that force majeure clauses have just become kind of a standard thing. It's boilerplate. It gets put in every contract. There hasn't been much thought to it. And one of the things that's already becoming obvious, with Chinese suppliers who got hit by COVID-19 early, is that many of these are going to turn into protracted lawsuits because the force majeure clauses simply weren't specific enough about what was covered. So is a virus a force majeure covered act? Is a war? Is a strike? Is a earthquake? But also, what's the remedy for that? Does that invalidate the contract and I have a get out of jail free card? Does it give me a temporary remedy for some period of time? And so these simply need to be much more specific about what's covered and then what is the effect of that on the supplier and on the customer. And in general, these procurement contracts need to deal much more explicitly with uncertainty. When there is major change, whether it's a supply disruption, a demand disruption, some kind of geopolitical disruption, whatever it is, without having to specify exactly what the event is, there needs to be a much more obvious way to cover what are my rights and responsibilities as a supplier and as a buyer. And so clarity around what are the requirements, what are the penalties, what are the termination rights, all of those kinds of things. And in a lot of cases, I just don't see those in procurement contracts. And it's not very helpful when the resolution of this is a lawsuit that may stretch on for years. And in the meantime, what do I do with my supply chain? I need to get that thing moving again. And if I don't have a good, clear, comprehensive contract, that makes it very difficult to do. Now, the good news is that technology can help with supply chain risk. One of the things we know is going to happen, has already happened, is that lots of people involved in the supply chain, whether they're your employees or your customers or your suppliers or regulators, whoever it is, many of them are not in the office. Many of them will never go back to the office. Companies are recognizing that having employees work from home is, helping with recruiting. In a lot of cases, productivity is better. Costs are lower. And so it is not going to be like it used to be. And so having those participants in the supply chain be remote means that we have to have systems and processes in place that allow them to work effectively, have visibility, collaborate, The requirement for speed and interaction isn't going away, but the way that it happens is going to be quite different. It's already there today, but it's going to be that way in the future. And so you need to have systems in place that facilitate that kind of interaction, the communication, the sharing of data, collaboration to come to a solution. And that's going to mean some technological changes and policy changes for a lot of manufacturers who simply aren't set up to operate that way today. And one of the things that we've been seeing evolve over the last few years, but I think we're going to see a much more aggressive approach to deploying customer and supplier portals to allow or facilitate the sharing of supply and demand information and inventory information and engineering change information, traceability data and quality data and so forth. And, you know, as I say, traditionally, manufacturers' information systems have been inward focused, you know, around controlling what happened inside the business. And what's going to need to happen is that you're going to have to invest in applications or build applications and capabilities that are much better at interacting up and down the supply chain outside the business, allowing people who aren't badged employees to get data, share information. And there are technological issues there, but attitude and policy issues are much more profound in terms of making that happen. But the good news is there is technology out there to do it. One of the things that Actify is working on, for instance, are applications to help manage that intercompany collaboration around a number of areas. And so I think, you know, those are the kinds of things that manufacturers are going to have to be investing in. And then finally, I think the bottom line on this whole supply chain response is striking an effective balance between the efficiency of the supply chain, which has been sort of the sole focus over the last 20 or 30 years, you know, lowest cost, fastest response, least amount of inventory, et cetera, and resiliency. How do I deal with disruptive change in the supply chain? Which isn't going away, and you know that we are apparently much more vulnerable to than we have been in the past. So you know, it's going to mean some changes in supply chain strategy. It doesn't mean that I'm no longer going to do just-in-time inventory, or I'm going to go back to having warehouses full of inventory. I don't think we're going to see that. But we are going to see some hedging of material. I think we'll probably see some different decisions about where manufacturing gets done. I think companies may move away from being religious about single source and having dual sources in some cases, or having a qualified alternate source that perhaps is not at the end of a long ocean freight transportation chain. In other words, thinking about my ability to respond and risk and resiliency as I set supply chain policy, which I don't think has happened nearly enough. And so with that, I'm going to stop, and Dave and I will try and answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Jim. Like Jim said, we now have Dave Opshal joining us. For those of you that want to submit questions, please submit them through the questions panel on the dashboard. And we've actually got a few interesting questions for you guys here. So let's start with this one. question is, alternate sourcing makes complete sense, but as we discovered with the scarcity of PPE for frontline medical workers, many products are just not manufactured in the USA anymore. Absent some kind of crisis, how do we restore and maintain a broader base of manufacturing domestically? Won't competitive pressures always push demand to the lowest cost source?
Um,
Wow.
well, I guess the answer is globalization isn't going away, and as we have gone to globalization, certain kinds of manufacturing have gravitated to certain places in the world because of the availability of raw materials or because of labor costs, I don't expect that really to change. As I said before, I don't, there'll be a lot of noise about, um, having critical materials or critical products made in the U.S. or made in France or whatever as a part of national strategy. But I don't see that that's something politicians are very good at. So I think we are going to be in a situation, like it or not, where uh, you need to understand what your supply chain is and which items can have a domestic source, or which items where my primary source may be a low cost location. 10,000 miles away, but I have an alternate source domestically, um, that I can call on in case of disruption. I think it's a question of this is the whole idea of doing supply chain risk assessment, is understanding where am I vulnerable and what can I do about it. And it may be maybe stocking policies. One of the other things, and Dave, you might have a view on this, is I don't think that engineering departments have ever been told that they have to consider supply chain when they're designing products. And so, they're perfectly free to spec components that are only made in one place, that's, highly vulnerable for some reason, when they could quite easily spec materials where the supply chain risk might be less.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever known procurement practices to be something that engineering's really respected all that well. In fact, I think that a real simple example of the kind of problem is engineering still in a lot of companies sources products they're already sourcing from a different supplier, and they simply make that choice based on the lack of knowledge about where things are being sourced, and the company doesn't have any ability then to consolidate purchases and get the price down. But I think an interesting discussion about the question that was asked is that in order to figure out how to modify your supply chain for resiliency, you've now got a question of, well, price is going to change, that price is going to roll up somewhere ultimately to the OEM's product, and how is it that you then understand how competitive you can be when you're not really sure what the OEM's price goals are? And that goes back to, I think, something you were talking about earlier, Jim, which is this, relationship-based sourcing doesn't allow, or the lack of it doesn't allow, that kind of information to be shared back and forth. So it's going to be hard, I think, for them to figure this out.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not an easy calculus. They have to do it in other areas of the business as well, where I have to understand, how big is the risk of disruption? What might the cost of that be? What's the real cost of an alternative supply chain strategy, and balance those out. Right now, what happens is that all the focus seems to be on just drive the price down without regard to where it may leave us vulnerable.
Yeah. Speaking of relationship-based sourcing, it's interesting because you see how well that works in Asia. If you do business over there and you travel over there as we have, you see how that works. What do you think's the barrier? Why that's not something that we've managed to adopt yet in North America and Europe?
Well, I sadly I'm old enough to remember when relationship-based sourcing existed in the United States. And it did because most of my suppliers were local. I knew them. I went to see them. They came to see me. We may have, they may have participated in the design. It was just a different environment as the supply chain stretched out globally. And I have to blame the auto industry for this. I mean, it goes, if you think about it, it really goes back to Ignacio Lopez and General Motors and this really really harsh sourcing policy of screw the vendor any way you can, and that hasn't gone away. And the people who are trained in that kind of buying environment are now the heads of procurement at tier ones, and they get trained and they become the heads of procurement in tier twos, and it is. It's habit to some extent to simply treat your vendors that way.
Yeah.
Another question we have, if you gentlemen are done. There's this talk about a second wave of the virus possibly forcing a second shutdown in the fourth quarter. Should that happen, manufacturers have some time, but very little time to be prepared. Is there anything you would suggest manufacturers do in the short window to be ready?
Well,
Oh
for me,
boy.
the obvious thing is to understand who are my key vendors, what are the key parts that where I feel I've got a problem, and start having those conversations, frank conversations. And it may be at the CEO to CEO level, or senior executive to senior executive, as opposed to purchasing to sales, where we can be open with one another and say, look, we may get hit. We need this supply. We want to buy this. We could get hit in November with another shutdown. How can we restructure the contract to protect both of us? So that it has the least impact possible. And that has to happen with a kind of direct conversation at an executive level.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think you have to start with the conversation, because a lot of the changes that Jim has proposed here are impossible to do if you don't have that kind of relationship. You have to start somewhere, and with the strategic suppliers, the ones that most impact your ability to deliver, that makes all the sense in the world. I agree. What else have we got, Charisse?
Okay, here's another one. As a smaller supplier, less than 5,000 people, we find it very hard to evaluate and procure technology to address supply chain communication that is affordable and easy enough to use, that our cost of ownership fits with our business model. What can you suggest for companies like ours to do better on the technology front?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that you can spend a lot of money on supply chain technology, and these are not inexpensive applications. And so my advice to smaller companies is generally look at what you absolutely have to do from a compliance perspective. In other words, what do your customers require you to be able to do in terms of exchanging supply and demand information? How do I what's the minimum that I can do there to allow me to do business with my customers. And then for the rest of the communication that needs to go on, the rest of this kind of bidirectional of conversation, don't get carried away buying elaborate applications to do that. In a lot of cases, I can get away with something as simple as text messaging. Since absolutely everybody I need to exchange information with has a phone. As long as I have discipline and policy inside the company about what communications take place, the means of it is less important than the discipline and structure to make it happen. When this happens, here are the people who get notified. When this happens, these people get notified. Text messaging is pretty simple and straightforward, but you can attach files, you can attach pictures, you can, I'm not sure emojis are particularly helpful in this situation, but it's ubiquitous bidirectional communication, and it's virtually free.
Yeah, I think that for small suppliers, Sharice, a huge issue that I've seen is typically the tendency is to overbuy. And what I mean by that is that, instead of, as Jim suggests, to start with the most practical things or the basic things that are essential, there's, a desire to make sure that we, make the choice that'll give us, the ability to grow into something, and yet that never seems to happen. There's always a desire to procure more technology than you can actually consume, and so that I think is the easiest way is pick the elements of your collaboration and communication strategy with your suppliers or with your customers that you need to support, and try to limit what you're doing rather than buy a huge comprehensive solution. You'll never integrate all of that. It's just not within the realm of most suppliers to do that.
Okay. Next question. You said that the current supply chain model uses complicated vertical supply chains, and that leaves you open to disruption, whereas if it was made in-house, that would mitigate the risk of disruption. I assume the current supply chain model is to do with being cost effective. Is this the case? And do you believe that manufacturers would not fall back to the current model in the same way anyone would go back to their old habits?
Well, we've gone about as far from vertical integration as we can get in a lot of industries where, if you're at the top of the supply chain, you may do the final assembly, sometimes not even that. And the vast majority, if not all, of the component and sub-assembly production is done elsewhere or done by somebody else. And in a lot of cases, larger companies have sold off the divisions that manufactured those parts and assemblies. I think this may put some pressure on companies to shift back a bit to more vertical integration. To recognize that one of the ways to secure a supply chain, is to have more control over actually making the stuff themselves. But I don't think we're going to see a major reversal of policy. It's that's just not the way, and it's certainly in part cost related. In part, it's labor availability. Can I get the trained employee to run the things, et cetera? But a lot of it is kind of fiscal policy. These companies have gone through multiple ownerships and multiple structures, and they're not going back to be those kind of vertically integrated manufacturers they used to be.
Yeah, I think we'll see more use of vertical integration for key strategic components or parts, but we're never going to go back to full vertical integration. There's too many options, especially with new technology in manufacturing like 3D printing, for the ability to create alternate sourcing strategies. So, you know, I think that I think we'll see a relatively little bit of vertical integration.
Thank you, Jim and Dave. So this will be our final questions, the last one we have here. Okay, it says, our company is a tier 1 supplier to the automotive industry, and we are constantly being beaten down by our customers on our prices. Yet much of the variation in our performance on a program is driven by either incomplete information coming from our customers, from information that changes frequently post-award, or, as is usually the case, both. What suggestions do you have on how to move to the relationship-based sourcing? Specifically, how do we set up the conversation?
Um, yeah, it's certainly a familiar complaint, and I think it's a valid one. And my advice to people in this situation is you simply have to get beyond the purchasing to sales relationship. I mean, at that level, it's not going to change. Because of the way the purchasing department on the buyer side and the sales department on the seller side are gold measured and trained and so forth, that isn't going to change it. In order to get to relationship-based sourcing, a relationship has to exist at a much higher level in the organization. And so a conversation has to take place at an executive level. I think it needs to start not with bitching about the fact that you're sending me bad information or you're making changes all the time, but rather, how do we work together to de-risk the supply chain, to improve our resiliency, and that's the way that conversation needs to get started.
Anything you'd like to add, Dave?
My hope would be that this is such an unusual event that we've experienced that executives and boards of companies are going to realize that if they don't start having these conversations that Jim was talking about, that they'll continue to see this kind of disruption. The relationship has to change if you're going to drive any of the practices that Jim's talked about into your supply chain strategy. So that's my thought.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone that submitted questions. It looks like we've addressed them all. Should you have any more questions after this webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is in the next slides, if you will, Jim. And if you have any specific questions for Jim and Dave, we'll make sure to get it to them. Once again, thank you all for your time and attendance. This webinar has been recorded, and you guys should be getting a link to the recording once it's ready. Thank you, Jim and Dave, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sheree. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.